I was 28 years old when my grandfather asked me a simple question that shattered my entire understanding of my life. It was a Thursday afternoon in late September, one of those crisp autumn days where the light comes through the windows at just the right angle, making everything look golden and perfect. I'd driven 3 hours to visit him at his estate, something I tried to do at least once a month despite my exhausting work schedule. My parents had come too, which wasn't unusual, though looking back now, I realized they'd been increasingly insistent about being present whenever I visited him alone. We were sitting in his study, the same room where I'd played as a child, back when I was small enough to hide under his massive oak desk. The room hadn't changed in decades. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and built-in bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound first editions and business journals going back 50 years. The air smelled like it always had: old leather, expensive cigars, and that particular scent of old money that I'd never been able to quite identify. Maybe it was the furniture polish they used on the antiques, or maybe it was just the smell of a life well lived and well earned. My grandfather sat in his usual chair, the burgundy leather one that had molded to his frame over 40 years of use. At 86, he was still sharp as a knife, still reading the Financial Times every morning, still making calls to his stockbroker and offering advice to the executives running his companies. His hands showed his age, spotted and weathered, but his mind was as clear as ever. Those sharp blue eyes that had stared down competitors and built an empire from absolutely nothing missed very little. He'd been asking me about my life, the way he always did. How was work going at the marketing firm where I'd finally landed a decent position after years of struggling? Was I still in that apartment in the city, the one bedroom I'd told him about? Was I saving money, planning for the future? Standard grandfather questions, the kind that showed he cared, even if we'd never been as close as I'd wished we could be. My parents had always maintained a certain distance between us, something I'd attributed to their pride, their desire not to seem like they were taking advantage of his wealth. Then, completely casually, as if he were asking about the weather, he looked at me with those penetrating blue eyes and asked how I'd invested the trust fund he'd set up for me when I was born. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if we'd discussed this 100 times before. As if it were common knowledge between us, just another topic of conversation like my job or my apartment, or what I'd had for breakfast that morning. I stared at him, my mind completely blank. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. The afternoon light suddenly seemed too bright, and I could hear the old grandfather clock in the corner ticking, each second impossibly loud in my ears. My mouth went dry, that particular kind of dry where your tongue feels too thick for your mouth, and you can't quite form words properly. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. A trust fund? Set up when I was born? The words didn't make sense. They didn't fit into any version of reality I understood. I'd grown up poor, or at least, I'd grown up thinking I was poor. I'd worked for every single thing I had. I'd taken out loans, worked multiple jobs, sacrificed and struggled and fought for every opportunity. The idea that there had been money, substantial money, sitting somewhere with my name on it was so foreign, so completely outside my understanding of my own life, that I couldn't even process it. I must have looked completely lost because my grandfather's expression started to change. The casual curiosity in his face shifted, transformed into something else. His eyebrows drew together slightly, and a small line appeared between them, the one that showed up when he was concerned or confused. His eyes sharpened, became more focused, and I could almost see his mind working, reassessing, calculating, the way it must have done thousands of times in boardrooms and negotiations throughout his long career. The room seemed to tilt slightly, or maybe it was just me, my sense of balance suddenly unreliable. I gripped the arms of my chair, feeling the smooth leather under my palms, trying to ground myself in something solid and real. My heart had started beating faster. That sick, heavy thud you feel in your chest when you know something is terribly, terribly wrong but you haven't quite figured out what it is yet. That's when I noticed my parents. They'd been standing near the doorway, half in the study, half in the hallway, the way they often positioned themselves during my visits with my grandfather. Observers, mediators, present but not quite participating. But now, their entire demeanor had changed in an instant. They had gone completely, utterly, devastatingly silent. Not the comfortable silence of people simply listening to a conversation. This was the silence of people who'd been caught, the silence of held breath and racing minds in desperate, panicked thinking. The silence of people watching their carefully constructed world begin to crumble around them. My mother's face had drained of color, becoming almost gray in the golden afternoon light. Her hand was pressed against her throat, fingers splayed, like she was trying to hold something back or hold something in. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and they kept darting between my grandfather and me, unable to settle, unable to meet anyone's gaze directly. My father had gone rigid, his entire body tense like a wire pulled too tight. His hand was on my mother's shoulder now, gripping it, and I could see his knuckles were white with the pressure. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He was a man who usually had something to say about everything, an opinion on every topic, a comment for every situation. But now he said nothing. He didn't even seem to be breathing. And in that moment, in that terrible, endless moment of their silence, I knew. I didn't know the details yet, didn't understand the scope or the depth or the full horror of what had happened. But I knew with absolute certainty that something unspeakable had occurred. Something that involved me, involved my life, involved the very foundation of everything I thought I understood about myself and my family. I knew that my life, as I had understood it for 28 years, had been built on a lie. To understand the full weight of what I was about to discover, you need to understand what my childhood was actually like. You need to understand the life I lived, the identity I built, the person I became, all based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my circumstances. My earliest memories are colored by financial anxiety. Not my anxiety, I was too young to feel it directly, but my parents' anxiety, which filled our home like a constant fog. I remember being 4 or 5 years old, asking for a toy I'd seen in a store, something simple, maybe $10 or $15. I remember the way my mother's face changed, the way her mouth tightened into a thin line, the way she knelt down to my eye level and explained, very seriously, that we couldn't afford things like that, that money didn't grow on trees, that we had to be careful with every penny. I learned earlier than most children, that asking for things caused pain. Not physical pain, but something worse. The pain of watching my mother's face crumple with stress, of seeing my father's shoulders sag with the weight of another request he couldn't fulfill. So I stopped asking. I became the child who never asked for anything, who was grateful for whatever I received, who understood that we were different from other families, that we had less, that we needed to be more careful. We lived in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was a 2-bedroom, maybe 800 square feet total, with thin walls where you could hear the neighbors arguing and the pipes clanging whenever someone upstairs took a shower. My bedroom was barely large enough for a twin bed and a small dresser. I didn't have a desk, so I did my homework on the kitchen table, clearing away the dinner plates and spreading out my notebooks and textbooks in the same space where we'd just eaten spaghetti or chicken or whatever budget-friendly meal my mother had prepared. The apartment wasn't terrible. It was clean, my mother made sure of that, and it was safe. But it was small, cramped, and it always felt temporary, like we were waiting to move somewhere better, somewhere more permanent, though that somewhere never materialized. The furniture was all second-hand, bought from thrift stores or found at garage sales. The couch had a broken spring that you had to avoid sitting on, and the kitchen table wobbled, unless you folded up a piece of cardboard and stuck it under one leg. Every back-to-school shopping trip was an exercise in careful budgeting and painful choices. We went to discount stores, the kind with fluorescent lighting and concrete floors, where everything was cheap but nothing was quite good enough. My mother would have a list, written in her neat handwriting, with a budget beside each item. 2 pairs of jeans, $30 maximum. 3 shirts, $20 total. 1 pair of shoes, $25, and they needed to last the entire school year. I remember standing in those stores, looking at the nicer shoes, the ones that cost $40 or $50, the ones the other kids at school wore. I remember wanting them so badly it physically hurt, but I never said anything. I learned to pick the cheaper option without being asked, to hold up the less expensive item, and pretend it was exactly what I wanted. I learned to smile and say thank you, even when the shoes pinched my feet or the jeans were stiff and uncomfortable. I wore hand-me-downs constantly, Clothes from my older cousins, from the children of my mother's friends, from the donation bins at church. Nothing ever fit quite right. The pants were always too long or too short, the shirts too big or too tight. I started middle school wearing a winter coat that was 2 sizes too large, the sleeves hanging past my hands, because it was free and we couldn't afford a new one. Kids noticed these things. Kids always notice. Field trips were another source of anxiety. Every permission slip that came home with a cost attached became a negotiation. $20 for the Science Museum. $35 for the overnight trip to the state capitol. $50 for the week-long outdoor education camp in 6th grade. I'd bring the forms home and watch my parents' faces as they looked at the amounts. I'd watch them exchange glances, having entire conversations without words, weighing this expense against all the others, trying to figure out how to make it work or how to explain to me why it couldn't. Sometimes they found the money. Sometimes they didn't. I missed the overnight trip to the Capitol because they said we couldn't afford it. I stayed home while my entire class got on a bus and spent 3 days visiting historical sites, and staying in a hotel, and bonding in all the ways that 11-year-olds bond when they're away from home together. When everyone came back and talked about it for weeks afterward, I had nothing to contribute. I just smiled and listened and pretended it didn't hurt to be left out. By high school, I was working. I got a job at 14. As soon as I was legally allowed, bussing tables at a local diner for minimum wage plus a cut of the server's tips. I worked Friday nights and weekend mornings, smelling like grease and coffee, while other kids my age were at football games or sleeping in, or doing whatever it is teenagers with money do with their free time. I saved almost every penny. I had a shoebox under my bed, and later a savings account at the local credit union, where I deposited my paychecks religiously. The money was for college. That's what I told myself, what my parents told me. I was going to college somehow, some way, and it was going to be on my own dime, because we simply didn't have the money to pay for it. My parents were very clear about my grandfather's wealth and our relationship to it. They explained, multiple times throughout my childhood, that yes, my grandfather was wealthy. Yes, he'd built successful businesses, and lived in a big house and drove nice cars. But that was his money, his success, his life. It wasn't ours. We were expected to make our own way in the world, to build our own success, to not rely on anyone else for handouts or help. They framed it as a point of pride, almost a badge of honor. We weren't the kind of people who lived off family money or expected inheritances. We were self-sufficient, independent, hardworking. My father would say that his father had pulled himself up from nothing, and he'd instilled that same work ethic in his children. That we needed to prove ourselves, to earn our own way, just like my grandfather had done. It made sense to me. It fit with everything I was experiencing, everything I was being taught about the value of hard work and self-reliance. I was proud of it, even. Proud that I wasn't some spoiled rich kid living off family money. Proud that I was working for everything I had. Proud that I was learning the value of $1 in a way that wealthy kids never would. When it came time to think about college, the reality was crushing. The guidance counselor at my high school talked about SAT scores and application essays and campus visits. She talked about choosing between schools, about finding the right fit, about following your dreams to whatever university called to you. But none of that applied to me. I couldn't afford application fees for multiple schools. I couldn't afford to visit campuses. I couldn't afford to follow any dreams that came with a price tag of $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 a year. So I made a different plan. Community college. It was practical, affordable, close to home. I could live with my parents, save on room and board, and work while taking classes. The tuition was a fraction of what a 4-year university would cost. It wasn't the dream. I'd wanted to study at a real university, to live on campus, to have that full college experience I'd seen in movies and read about in books. But it was realistic. It was what I could afford. It was what my life circumstances allowed. I applied to the local community college and started classes the fall after I graduated high school. I was still working at the diner, now promoted to server, making better tips but still struggling to cover tuition and books and fees. Financial aid helped, but it didn't cover everything. So I took out loans. Small loans at first, just a few $1,000s to bridge the gap between what financial aid covered and what everything actually cost. The loans grew. Books were expensive, hundreds of dollars per semester for heavy textbooks I'd use for 4 months, and then try to sell back for a fraction of what I'd paid. Fees for lab courses, technology fees, parking passes, student activity fees that were mandatory even though I never had time for student activities because I was always working. It all added up, and the loans kept growing, a debt counter in the back of my mind that increased semester after semester. After 2 years at community college, I transferred to a public state university to finish my bachelor's degree. It was the cheapest option that would still give me a degree from a 4-year institution, something that mattered for job prospects. But even the cheapest option was expensive. Tuition, fees, books, housing. Even though I found the most affordable apartment I could, splitting a 2-bedroom with 3 other students, sleeping on a futon in the living room, it was thousands and thousands of dollars per semester. I worked multiple jobs. Server at a restaurant near campus, nights and weekends. Retail at a clothing store in the mall, picking up shifts whenever I could. Freelance graphic design work I found online, staying up until 2 or 3 in the morning to finish projects for clients who paid $20 or $30 for hours of work. I was constantly exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, falling asleep in lectures, studying during my 15-minute breaks at work. I watched my friends, the ones from families with more money, live completely different college experiences. They joined sororities and fraternities. They went to parties and football games. They studied abroad in Spain and Italy and France, posting pictures from Barcelona and Rome and Paris on social media, while I was working double shifts to make rent. They did unpaid internships at prestigious companies because they could afford to work for free for a summer, building resumes and networks while I was serving tables because I needed actual money to survive. They graduated with job offers from those internships, with professional networks and connections and opportunities that had been built over 4 years of having the time and money to invest in their futures. I graduated with $60,000 in student loan debt, and a desperate need to find any job that would pay enough to start making payments. I never went on spring break trips. I never studied abroad. I never had the luxury of taking an unpaid internship or exploring my options or figuring out what I really wanted to do with my life. I was in survival mode, constantly, from the moment I started college until the moment I graduated and beyond. Every decision was about money, about what I could afford, about what I could sacrifice to make it one more semester, one more month, one more day. I ate ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. I skipped meals to save money. I walked miles to avoid paying for parking or public transportation. I wore the same 3 outfits to class for years because I couldn't afford new clothes. I never went to the doctor unless I was seriously ill because I didn't have health insurance and couldn't afford the bills. I lived in a constant state of low-level anxiety about money, about debt, about whether I'd be able to make it, always feeling like I was one unexpected expense away from complete financial disaster. And through it all, through every struggle and sacrifice and moment of desperate worry about how I was going to pay for textbooks or rent or groceries, I was proud. Proud of my work ethic. Proud of my independence. Proud that I was doing it myself, building something from nothing, just like my grandfather had done. I was living proof that you didn't need money handed to you, that you could make it through sheer determination and hard work. That pride was something I clung to. It was my identity. I was the person who'd worked for everything. The person who'd never had anything handed to them. The person who understood struggle and sacrifice in a way that privileged people never would. It made me feel strong, resilient, capable of handling anything life threw at me. I had no idea that everything I believed about myself, about my life, about my identity as someone who'd overcome financial hardship through hard work and determination, was built on a lie. A lie so massive, so complete, so carefully maintained, that it had shaped every single aspect of my existence for 28 years. The silence in my grandfather's study stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. In that span of time, everything shifted. The comfortable, familiar room where I'd spent countless afternoons suddenly felt alien and threatening, like I'd stepped into a different dimension where the rules I'd always known no longer applied. My grandfather's face had transformed completely. The casual, grandfatherly warmth had evaporated, replaced by something much harder, much sharper. This was the face that had negotiated million-dollar deals, the face that had built an empire from nothing, the face that didn't tolerate nonsense or evasion or lies. His blue eyes had gone from curious to concerned to something else entirely. A cold, calculating assessment that made me understand, for the first time, why people had called him ruthless in business. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his weathered hands gripping the armrests, and I could see the muscles in his jaw working. He was thinking, processing, putting pieces together, and whatever conclusions he was reaching were making him angrier by the second. The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the warm afternoon sunshine still streaming through the windows. I opened my mouth to respond, to tell him again that I had no idea what he was talking about, but before I could form words, he repeated the question. Slower this time. More deliberate. Each word enunciated clearly, as if he were speaking to someone who didn't understand English well, or someone who might be lying. He asked me again about the trust fund, about the $5 million he'd placed in trust for me when I was born, on the day I came into this world, about how I'd managed it, how I'd invested it, what I'd done with it over the years since I'd gained access to it. His voice had that dangerous calm to it, the kind of calm that's actually more frightening than yelling, the kind that tells you someone is exercising tremendous self-control to not explode. I felt my own face flush, heat rising from my neck to my cheeks. My hands were shaking, and I pressed them against my thighs to try to stop the trembling. I told him, my voice coming out weaker than I intended, that I didn't know anything about a trust fund, that this was the first I was hearing about it, that there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding. And then, because the truth of my life suddenly felt important to say out loud, to make real in this moment when everything felt surreal, I started talking. I told him about the student loans, about the $60,000 in debt I was still paying off, making minimum payments every month, watching the interest accumulate, knowing I'd be paying for my education for the next decade at least. I told him about the scholarships I'd fought for, spending hours on applications and essays, competing against thousands of other students for $1,000 here, $1,500 there, every little bit helping but never enough. I told him about the 3 jobs I'd worked simultaneously during my senior year of college, how I'd scheduled my classes so they were all on Tuesday and Thursday, so I could work longer shifts on the other days. I told him about living on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches, about skipping meals to save money, about walking miles in the rain because I couldn't afford parking or gas, about wearing the same winter coat for 6 years because buying a new one meant not making rent that month, about the time I'd had a cavity and waited 3 months to get it filled because I didn't have dental insurance and had to save up the $300 the dentist wanted. With every word I spoke, my grandfather's face hardened further. His knuckles were white where he gripped the chair, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. His lips had pressed into a thin line, and his eyes, those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, had started to glisten slightly, though whether with tears or rage, I couldn't tell. But it was my parents' reaction that really told me everything I needed to know. They were still standing by the doorway, frozen like statues, and as I spoke, as I laid out the reality of my life for the past decade, they seemed to shrink into themselves. My mother was crying now, tears running silently down her face, but she wasn't making a sound. Her hand was still pressed to her throat, and her eyes were squeezed shut like she couldn't bear to look at me or my grandfather. Her whole body was shaking, trembling like she was standing in a freezing wind even though the study was warm. My father's grip on her shoulder had tightened even more, if that was possible. His face had gone from white to red, a deep, mottled red that spread from his collar to his hairline. He was sweating, I could see the sheen on his forehead, and his eyes were darting around the room like he was looking for an escape route, some way out of this situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. Neither of them said a word. Neither of them contradicted my story or my grandfather's mention of the trust fund. Neither of them looked confused or surprised. They didn't rush to explain that there must be some mistake, some mix-up, some reasonable explanation for why I didn't know about this money. Their silence was a confession. Their terror was an admission of guilt. And in that moment, watching them try to make themselves invisible, try to disappear into the wallpaper, I understood with crushing, horrible certainty that they knew exactly what my grandfather was talking about. They'd always known. They'd known about this money my entire life, and they'd never told me. My grandfather saw it too. I watched his gaze shift from me to them, watched his eyes narrow as he assessed their reactions, their body language, their complete inability to meet his stare. He was reading them the way he'd read thousands of business opponents over his long career. And what he was reading was making something cold and terrible settle into his expression. The grandfather I'd known, the one who'd been kind if distant, who'd sent birthday cards with $20 bills inside, who'd asked me gentle questions about my life during my occasional visits, that grandfather was gone. In his place was the businessman, the negotiator, the man who'd started with nothing and built an empire by being smarter and tougher and more ruthless than everyone else. He turned back to me, and when he spoke his voice was different. Not angry exactly, but controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than rage would have been. He asked me how old I was. I told him 28. He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he'd been calculating. Then he asked when I'd graduated from college. 3 years ago, I told him. He nodded again, and I could almost see the wheels turning in his mind. See him doing the math, lining up dates and ages and realizations. 25, he said quietly, almost to himself. You turned 25 3 years ago. That was when you were supposed to receive full control of the trust. That was when your parents' guardianship over the funds was supposed to end, when everything was supposed to be transferred directly to you, with complete transparency and documentation of every transaction that had occurred in the previous 25 years. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The air went out of my lungs and I couldn't seem to get it back. 25. 3 years ago. I turned 25 while working double shifts at a restaurant, eating cereal for dinner because it was cheap, lying awake at night worrying about student loan payments and credit card debt, and how I was going to afford new tires for my car that was on its last legs. I'd turned 25 and my parents had taken me out for a modest dinner at a chain restaurant, given me a card and a sweater, and never said a word about millions of dollars that were supposed to be transferred to me that year. They'd watched me blow out candles on a grocery store cake, had hugged me and wished me well, had listened to me talk about my job search and my financial stress, and they'd said nothing. My grandfather stood up from his chair, moving stiffly, his age showing in his movements in a way it rarely did. He walked to his desk, a massive antique thing that had been in this study for as long as I could remember, and opened one of the drawers. He pulled out a folder, a thick manila folder that looked like it had been handled many times, the edges worn soft and the color faded from years of being taken out and put away. He set it on the desk with a soft thump that sounded impossibly loud in the silent room. For a long moment he just stared at it, his hand resting on top, like he was gathering strength or courage, or maybe just trying to control the rage that I could see building in the set of his shoulders. Then he looked at my parents, really looked at them, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper but it carried across the room like a shout. He told them he wanted to speak with me alone. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered in a tone that made it clear there would be no discussion, no negotiation, no argument. My mother made that sound again, that little gasp that was almost a sob, and my father's hand finally released her shoulder. They looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that couples who've been together for decades can have without words. I could see the panic in their eyes, the desperate desire to stay, to control the situation, to manage what was about to happen. But they couldn't. Not with my grandfather staring at them with that cold, implacable expression. Not with the evidence of whatever they'd done sitting in a folder on his desk. Not with their lies unraveling in real time in front of them. They left. They actually left. My father put his hand on the small of my mother's back and guided her out of the study, and she went, stumbling slightly, her hand over her mouth like she was holding back sobs or vomit or words she couldn't afford to let out. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded like a prison door slamming shut. And then it was just me and my grandfather, and that folder on his desk and the terrible, weighted silence of truth that was about to be spoken and couldn't be taken back once it was said aloud. My grandfather didn't say anything for a long moment after my parents left. He just stood there at his desk, one hand still resting on that folder, staring out the window at the manicured lawn, and the maple trees that were just starting to turn orange and red with the season. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the room. and I could hear the old clock ticking on the mantelpiece, each second stretching out impossibly long. Finally, he moved. He picked up the folder, carried it back to his chair, and sat down heavily, like the weight of what he was holding was more than just paper and ink. He gestured for me to move my chair closer, and I did, my legs feeling unsteady, my whole body thrumming with an anxiety I couldn't name. He opened the folder slowly, carefully, like he was handling something fragile or sacred. Inside were documents, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Papers and forms and statements, all neatly organized in chronological order, each one in a plastic protective sleeve. He pulled out the first document and handed it to me. It was dated 28 years and 2 months ago. The month I was born. The exact month, the exact year. It was a trust document, official and legal, full of language I didn't entirely understand, but whose meaning was crystal clear. My grandfather's name at the top as the grantor. My name, my full legal name, as the beneficiary. My parents' names as trustees and guardians of the trust until I reached the age of majority. The amount made me blink, made me read it again to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. $5 million, placed in trust for my benefit, to be managed conservatively and in my best interests until I turned 18, at which point I would be informed of the trust's existence and included in decisions about its management, and then fully transferred to my control at 25. $5 million. When I was born. Before I'd taken my first breath or opened my eyes or done anything to deserve or earn or justify that kind of money, my grandfather had looked at his newborn grandchild and decided to give me a foundation, a safety net, a gift that would mean I'd never have to struggle the way he had struggled during the Depression, working from the age of 12 to help feed his family, dropping out of school at 14 because they needed his income more than they needed his education. I looked up at him and I could see it in his face. This had mattered to him. This hadn't been some casual gesture or tax strategy or wealthy man's whim. This had been personal. This had been about making sure his grandchildren, his blood, his legacy, would have opportunities he'd never had. That we'd be able to get educations, start businesses, buy homes, build lives without the crushing weight of poverty that had defined his own childhood. He'd grown up poor, desperately poor, in a way that people who've never experienced it can't quite understand. He'd told me stories before, brief snippets that he'd share when the mood struck him, about wearing cardboard in his shoes when the soles wore through because his family couldn't afford new ones, about going to school hungry because there wasn't enough food for everyone, about watching his mother cry over bills they couldn't pay and his father work himself literally to death at 48, his body giving out from decades of 12-hour days in a factory. That poverty had driven him. It had made him determined, relentless, almost obsessed with building wealth not just for himself, but for his children and their children. He'd started his first business at 19 with money he'd saved working 2 jobs for 3 years. He'd failed twice before succeeding on the 3rd try. He'd worked 80-hour weeks for decades, sacrificed time with his family, sacrificed his health, all to build something that would last, something that would mean his descendants would never know the kind of hunger and desperation he'd known. And now, holding this document, I realized that I was supposed to be proof of his success. I was supposed to be the grandchild who got an education without debt, who started adult life with a foundation instead of a burden, who had options and opportunities and the freedom to take chances because there was always a safety net below. Except I wasn't. I'd struggled just like he had, maybe not to the same degree, maybe not with cardboard in my shoes and an empty stomach, but I'd struggled. I'd worked myself to exhaustion. I'd sacrificed opportunities. I'd graduated with crushing debt and started my adult life already behind, already drowning in obligations and payments and the constant stress of financial insecurity. And it had all been completely, utterly unnecessary. My grandfather pulled out another document and another and another. He walked me through the trust structure, explaining in his clear, precise way exactly how it was supposed to work. The $5 million had been invested conservatively, placed in a diversified portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate investments. The goal was steady, reliable growth with minimal risk. This wasn't gambling money or lottery winnings. This was meant to be a foundation, something stable and secure. The trust was supposed to pay for my education, cover all costs associated with it. Tuition, fees, books, housing, everything. The idea was that I'd graduate with no debt, able to start my career and my life without that burden hanging over me. My parents, as trustees, were supposed to ensure this happened, were supposed to pay my educational expenses directly from the trust fund. Beyond education, the trust was supposed to provide for my general welfare. If I needed medical care, if I had an emergency, if there was anything I required for my health and well-being, the trust could provide it. My parents had discretion in how they used the funds, but always with the understanding that every dollar spent had to be for my benefit, not theirs. At 18, I was supposed to be informed that the trust existed. I was supposed to be given statements showing its value and how it had been managed. I was supposed to be included in conversations about investment strategies and risk tolerance. The trust would still be managed by my parents, but I was supposed to be aware of it, to understand it, to start learning how to handle substantial assets in preparation for taking full control at 25. At 25, everything was supposed to transfer to me. Complete control, no restrictions, no guardianship. The trust would be dissolved, the assets transferred directly to accounts in my name, and my parents would provide a complete accounting of every single transaction that had occurred over those 25 years. Every deposit, every withdrawal, every investment decision, every fee paid, every dollar spent, all of it documented and explained and justified. That was how it was supposed to work. That was the plan my grandfather had established, the safety net he'd constructed with such care and intention. But as he continued pulling documents from that folder, as he showed me statement after statement, year after year, I began to understand that something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. The early statements looked fine. The first few years showed the initial $5 million invested conservatively, growing steadily with market returns and dividend reinvestments. By the time I was 5 years old, the trust was worth over $6 million. By 10, it had grown to nearly $7 million. The growth wasn't spectacular, but it was steady, reliable, exactly what you'd want for a long-term trust fund. But then, when I was around 11 or 12, things started to change. There were withdrawals. Large withdrawals. $50,000 here, $75,000 there, $100,000 in a single transaction. Each one was documented with a reason. Educational expenses, medical costs, general welfare of the beneficiary. All technically within the scope of what the trustees were allowed to do. Except none of those withdrawals had been for me. None of them. My grandfather explained that he'd received annual statements as the grantor of the trust. He'd reviewed them, seen the withdrawals, but had assumed they were legitimate. After all, raising a child is expensive. Education is expensive. He trusted his son and daughter-in-law to use the money appropriately, to use it for my benefit as they were legally obligated to do. He'd never questioned it. Why would he? These were his son's decisions, made as my parent and guardian. And the statements showed that despite the withdrawals, the trust was still growing, still healthy, still on track to provide me with substantial assets when I came of age. By the time I was 18, despite the withdrawals, the trust still held over $5 million. Not bad at all. But what my grandfather didn't know, what he had no way of knowing from the statements alone, was that I'd never been told about the trust. That I'd turned 18 and gone off to community college, taking out loans, working multiple jobs, completely unaware that there was money with my name on it that was supposed to be paying for my education. The withdrawals continued and accelerated during my college years. By the time I was 22, graduating from university, the trust that had once held $7 million at its peak had been reduced to less than $2 million. Massive withdrawals, hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time, all documented with vague justifications that technically complied with the trust's terms, but clearly weren't being used for my actual benefit. And then, in the year I turned 25, when the trust was supposed to be transferred to me in its entirety, when my parents were supposed to provide a full accounting and hand over everything they'd been managing on my behalf, something truly shocking appeared in the statements. A series of large withdrawals, made over the course of just a few months, draining the trust down to almost nothing. By the time my 25th birthday actually arrived, the trust held less than $300,000, out of what should have been over $7 million at that point. Over $7 million. That's what the trust should have been worth when I turned 25. My grandfather showed me the projections, the calculations based on the original 5 million, and the average market returns over those 25 years. With conservative investing and minimal withdrawals for legitimate educational expenses, I should have received somewhere between $7 and $8 million. Instead, the trust had been systematically drained. My parents had taken the money, year after year, withdrawal after withdrawal, until there was almost nothing left. And then when the time came to transfer what remained to me, when they were supposed to hand over the accounts and the documentation, and explain what had happened to the missing millions, they'd simply said nothing. They'd let the date pass without acknowledgement, let me continue living in ignorance, hoping I'd never find out. The number on the most recent statement made my vision blur, and my hands shake. $743,000. That's what was left. Out of what should have been over $7 million. They'd taken more than $6 million. Gone. Spent. Vanished into whatever black hole had swallowed my parents' integrity, along with my future. I couldn't breathe properly. The room felt too hot and too cold at the same time. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest so hard I could feel it in my throat. $7 million. That's not just money. That's security. That's freedom. That's the ability to buy a house, start a business, take risks, pursue dreams, help others, build a life without the constant weight of financial anxiety crushing down on every decision. $7 million could have paid off my student loans 60 times over. It could have bought me a house outright, with enough left over to never worry about money again for the rest of my life, if I was even moderately careful. It could have let me take that unpaid internship at the design firm I'd dreamed of working for. The one that would have launched my career in ways my actual jobs never could. It could have let me study abroad, travel, experience life, build connections and memories and opportunities that weren't available to people who had to work 3 jobs just to survive. And my parents had taken it. They'd stolen it really, because that's what this was. Theft. Maybe not legally, maybe they'd technically been within their rights as trustees to withdraw funds for my benefit, but they hadn't used it for my benefit. They'd used it for themselves. They'd stolen my future, and they'd watched me struggle, and they'd said nothing. My grandfather's hands were shaking now too. He was old, 86, and the emotion of this moment was taking a visible toll on him. His face had gone pale, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure, to keep that businesslike demeanor in place even as everything he'd planned and hoped for his grandchildren crumbled before his eyes. He told me he was sorry. His voice cracked when he said it, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time in my life. He said he should have checked more carefully, should have asked more questions, should have demanded to see receipts and documentation for those withdrawals. He'd trusted his son, and that trust had been betrayed in the worst possible way. But I couldn't focus on his apology. I couldn't focus on anything except the enormity of what I'd just learned. My entire life, everything I'd believed about myself and my circumstances, had been a lie. I hadn't been poor. I hadn't needed to struggle. Every hardship I'd endured, every sacrifice I'd made, every opportunity I'd passed up, every night I'd cried from exhaustion and stress and fear about how I was going to survive. All of it had been completely, totally, devastatingly unnecessary. I'd had $7 million, and my parents had stolen it. Over the next several hours, in that study that had become both a confessional and a courtroom, the full scope of my parents' betrayal emerged. My grandfather, with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent a lifetime analyzing financial documents and sniffing out discrepancies, began making phone calls. To his attorneys, to his accountants, to the financial institution that had managed the trust, to investigators who specialized in financial fraud. I sat there, numb as he worked. I couldn't process what I'd learned. My mind kept trying to make sense of it, to find some explanation that would make this less horrible, less completely shattering to my understanding of reality. But there was no explanation that made it better. There was only the truth, and the truth was monstrous. My parents had stolen from me, from their own child for years. Systematically, deliberately, with full knowledge of what they were doing. And they'd watched me suffer the consequences of not having that money without ever once considering that maybe, just maybe, they should stop and do the right thing. The investigators worked fast, probably faster than they normally would because they were working for my grandfather, whose name still carried weight in business circles throughout the region. Within a week, they'd traced a substantial portion of where the money had gone. The picture they painted was somehow worse than I'd imagined, and I'd spent the past 7 days imagining increasingly awful scenarios. It started innocently enough, or at least they'd probably told themselves it was innocent. My father had wanted to start a business. He'd been working a corporate job that he hated, and he'd had this idea, this dream of being his own boss, running his own company. It was a technology startup, something to do with software solutions for small businesses. This was back when I was about 10 years old, back when the tech boom was making millionaires overnight, and everyone thought they could be the next big success story. He'd needed capital. Starting a business isn't cheap, especially a tech business. He needed money for development, for marketing, for office space, for hiring employees. He could have gone to banks, could have sought investors, could have done any number of legitimate things to fund his venture. Instead, he'd looked at that trust fund, at those millions of dollars just sitting there, growing slowly but surely, and he'd convinced himself that he could use it. Just temporarily, he'd told himself. Just borrow it for the business. He'd pay it back with interest once the company took off. It would be better for me anyway, he'd reasoned, because instead of getting the initial $5 million, I'd get back $6 or $7 million after his business made it big. It was a win-win, an investment in our family's future, not theft. That's how he'd justified it to himself. He'd taken $500,000 from the trust. Then another $500,000. Then $1 million. The business consumed money like a black hole, always needing more for this or that, always one more investment away from profitability. And it failed. Of course it failed. Most startups fail, especially ones run by people who don't really know what they're doing, who are learning on the fly with other people's money, who've never had to face real consequences for their bad decisions because they were playing with a safety net they'd stolen from their child. The business collapsed after 3 years, taking nearly $2 million of my money with it. But by then, my parents had discovered something dangerous. They could take money from the trust, and nothing bad happened to them. No one questioned it. No one stopped them. As long as they labeled the withdrawals correctly on the statements, as long as they claimed it was for my benefit, they could take whatever they wanted. And take they did. My mother had always liked nice things. She'd grown up middle class, comfortable but not wealthy, and she'd always felt like she'd married down when she'd chosen my father, who came from money but had been largely cut off from it by my grandfather's insistence that he make his own way. She'd resented it, resented living in a small apartment, resented having to budget, resented watching her friends from college live in nice houses and drive nice cars while she scraped by. So when the opportunity presented itself, when my father had already broken the seal on taking money from the trust, my mother decided she deserved some too. She started shopping. Not obvious shopping, not fur coats and diamond necklaces, but expensive shopping nonetheless. Designer clothes, high-end makeup, spa treatments, luxury handbags. She hid it well, kept the expensive items at her sister's house or in storage, wore the designer clothes only when I wasn't around. The shopping became an addiction, a compulsion. The investigators found credit card bills showing purchases at Neiman Marcus, Saks, Nordstrom, sometimes $5,000 or $6,000 in a single shopping trip. And when the credit cards maxed out, when the bills came due, my parents paid them off with my money. Tens of thousands of dollars, then hundreds of thousands, all flowing out of the trust to fund my mother's shopping habit. But that still didn't account for all of it. $2 million for the failed business, maybe another $1 million for my mother's shopping over the years. That left over $3 million unaccounted for. Where had it gone? The investigators dug deeper, and that's when they found my father's other problem. He gambled. Not casually, not a few hands of poker with friends or occasional lottery tickets. He gambled seriously, compulsively, destructively. He had accounts at online casinos. He took trips to Vegas and Atlantic City, trips I'd never known about because they happened when I was at school or work. He bet on sports, on horses, on anything and everything that offered odds and the illusion that this time, this bet, would be the one that paid off big. The gambling losses were staggering. In one particularly bad year, when I was 22 and working myself to exhaustion to pay for my final year of college, my father had lost nearly $800,000 gambling. $800,000. In 1 year, while I was eating ramen and sleeping 4 hours a night, and wondering how I was going to make my loan payment. Some months he won. That's how gambling addiction works, isn't it? You win just enough to keep you coming back, to convince you that you can beat the odds, that you're smarter than the system. But overall, over the years he lost. He lost consistently, predictably, the way everyone loses when they gamble long enough. The house always wins in the end. And every loss, every debt, every marker he had to pay off, it all came from the trust. From my money. From the $7 million that was supposed to be sitting there, growing, waiting for me to turn 25 and take control of my own future. But the investigators found even more. Things that made me feel physically sick when I learned about them. My parents had bought a house. Not the small apartment where I'd grown up, where I thought we'd lived because we couldn't afford anything better. A real house, a nice house, in an upscale neighborhood 3 towns over. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 2-car garage, a yard with mature trees and professional landscaping. They'd bought it when I was 19, during my first year at community college. They'd paid for it in cash, $650,000 straight from the trust. And they'd never told me. They'd kept paying rent on the apartment, kept living there most of the time, kept up the appearance of being a struggling family living paycheck to paycheck. But they had a house. A beautiful house where they'd go on weekends, where they'd host parties I was never invited to, where they'd lived a completely different life that I knew nothing about. The investigators found photos. Social media posts from my mother's friends, tagged at this address, showing birthday parties and barbecues and holiday gatherings. My parents, smiling and relaxed in their lovely home, with their lovely things, living the life they'd stolen from me while I worked double shifts and worried about making rent. There were cars too. A BMW for my father, a Mercedes for my mother, both registered to the house address I'd never known existed. They kept them in the garage at the house, drove them when they were living their other life, while they drove a beat-up old Honda when they were with me, maintaining the fiction of financial struggle. There were vacations, cruises to the Caribbean, trips to Europe, luxury resorts in Hawaii and Mexico, all charged to credit cards that were paid off with trust money, all taken during times when they told me they were at work conferences or visiting relatives. My mother's social media, which I'd never really paid attention to before, was full of vacation photos geotagged in places I'd never imagined she'd been. There she was in front of the Eiffel Tower. There they were on a beach in Turks and Caicos. There was my father holding a drink with an umbrella in it, sunburnt and grinning, while I was back home working the lunch shift at a diner. And then there was my cousin's college fund. My aunt, my mother's sister, had 3 kids. Raising 3 kids on a teacher's salary is hard. And college for all 3 of them was going to be essentially impossible without substantial loans. So my parents, feeling generous with money that wasn't theirs, had helped. They'd put $100,000 toward each of my 3 cousins' education funds. $300,000 total. Money they'd taken from my trust to send my cousins to college while I worked and borrowed, and struggled to pay for my own community college education. My cousins didn't know where the money came from. They thought it was just their aunt and uncle being generous, helping family. They'd written thank you cards. I found them later, going through my mother's things. Sweet cards from kids who thought they were being helped by loving relatives, not knowing that the money had been stolen from me. Every detail was another knife wound. Every discovery made it worse. The investigators kept finding more. Jewelry, artwork, investments in other people's businesses, loans to friends that were never repaid, luxury furniture, expensive electronics, premium gym memberships, country club dues at a club I never knew they belonged to. On and on it went, a cascade of expenditures and purchases and indulgences, all funded by money that was supposed to be mine. The investigators estimated that they'd found the trail of about $5.5 million. The remaining $500,000 or so was probably lost to poor record-keeping, cash withdrawals that couldn't be tracked, or expenses so scattered and varied that they'd never be able to trace them all. But the general picture was clear. My parents had stolen my trust fund and used it to live a double life, one where they were wealthy and comfortable and free from financial worry, while maintaining a fiction of poverty with me. And the most damning thing, the thing that made it impossible to see this as anything other than deliberate, calculated theft, was that they'd planned for the endgame. When I turned 25, when the trust was supposed to be transferred to me, they'd accelerated their withdrawals. They'd known the day was coming when they'd have to account for the money, and instead of trying to pay some of it back or confess, or do anything resembling the right thing, they'd drained the last remaining substantial amounts out of the trust as fast as they could. They'd known exactly what they were doing. They'd known it was wrong. They'd known I'd be devastated if I ever found out. And they'd done it anyway, year after year, withdrawal after withdrawal, until there was almost nothing left of the $7 million that was supposed to be my future. After learning where the money had gone, I spent days in a fog of disbelief and rage and grief. Grief for the life I should have had, for the opportunities I'd missed, for the version of myself that would have existed if I'd grown up knowing I had security and support instead of growing up in artificial poverty. But more than anything, I felt betrayed. Not just by what my parents had done, but by the 1,000 little lies that had supported the big lie. Every conversation, every interaction, every moment of my life with them had been contaminated by their deception. I started thinking back, connecting dots that I'd never noticed before, seeing patterns that had always been there but that I'd been too trusting, too naive, too conditioned to accept my parents' version of reality to recognize. Like how they'd always discouraged me from spending too much time with my grandfather. They'd framed it as protecting me, said he was demanding and difficult, that he had expectations I couldn't meet, that his wealth made him disconnected from reality. They'd said he was judgmental, that he'd look down on me for going to community college instead of an expensive private university, that he'd be disappointed in my choices. None of it had been true. My grandfather wasn't any of those things. But keeping me at a distance from him served their purposes perfectly. It meant there were fewer opportunities for him to ask questions about my education, about my finances, about why I was struggling when there was supposed to be money available to help me. It meant they could control the narrative, could feed him whatever story they wanted about where the trust money was going without me contradicting them. I remembered now how they'd always been present during my visits with him, how they'd never left us alone for long, always hovering nearby, always ready to jump into the conversation if it started going in directions they didn't like. I'd thought they were being protective, maybe a little clingy. I hadn't realized they were running interference, making sure their lies stayed intact. And the birthday and Christmas checks. My grandfather had a tradition of giving his grandchildren checks for birthdays and holidays. Never huge amounts, $100 here, $200 there, but meaningful gifts from a grandfather who wanted to help. I'd received those checks religiously every year. Except now I realized that the amounts were probably much larger than what I actually received. My parents had always insisted on holding the checks for me, said they'd deposit them in my account for safekeeping. I trusted them. Why wouldn't I? They were my parents. But now I wondered how much of that money I'd actually seen, versus how much they'd kept for themselves. I thought about college, about how they'd reacted when I said I wanted to apply to four-year universities. They'd discouraged it strongly, said community college was the smart choice, the practical choice, that I'd be throwing money away on name-brand education when I could get the same degree for less. They'd made me feel foolish for even wanting more, made me feel like I was being unrealistic and naive for dreaming of a traditional college experience. Of course they'd pushed me toward community college. It was cheaper, which meant less chance that I'd qualify for financial aid that might have revealed the existence of the trust. It kept me local, living at home, under their supervision and control. It meant I'd never go to a financial aid office and fill out forms that might have triggered questions about why I was claiming poverty when there was a trust fund with my name on it. Everything they'd done, every choice they'd guided me toward, every opportunity they'd discouraged me from pursuing, it had all been about protecting their secret. About keeping me in the dark long enough for them to drain the trust fund completely, until there was nothing left to discover. I thought about my 25th birthday. They'd seemed tense that day. I remembered now. My mother had been crying, which I'd attributed to empty nest syndrome, or just emotional maternal feelings about me reaching a milestone age. My father had been drinking more than usual, which I'd noticed but not questioned. They'd both been quiet, subdued, not quite meeting my eyes. They'd known. That day, they'd known that legally, ethically, morally, they were supposed to be telling me about the trust. They were supposed to be handing over account information and statements and documentation. They were supposed to be explaining what had happened to the $7 million I should have received. And instead, they'd taken me to dinner at a chain restaurant, given me a card with a generic message and a sweater from a department store, and said nothing. How had they lived with themselves? How had they looked at me, their child, struggling and stressed and working myself to exhaustion, and not felt compelled to confess? How had they watched me eat ramen for dinner, and worry about making rent and agonize over whether I could afford to replace my worn-out shoes, and not felt crushing guilt for what they'd done? I thought about conversations we'd had about my grandfather's wealth, how they'd always spoken about it with a mixture of resentment and disdain, said that having money given to you made you soft, that earning your own way built character. They'd framed their decision to not rely on family wealth as noble, as teaching me important values about self-reliance and hard work. But it had all been lies. Lies to cover up their theft. Lies to justify why I couldn't have access to money that was legally mine. Lies to make me complicit in my own poverty, to make me proud of struggling, to make me believe that this was how things had to be when it wasn't, when it had never been. I thought about my mother's sister, my aunt, and those college funds for my cousins. My parents had positioned themselves as generous family members, helping out relatives who were struggling. My aunt had been so grateful, so overwhelmed by their kindness. She'd told everyone what wonderful people her sister and brother-in-law were, how selfless, how generous, helping to send her kids to college when they themselves were barely scraping by. The irony was crushing. Everyone thought my parents were sacrificing to help family when really they were spending stolen money to look good, to feel good about themselves, to play the role of generous benefactors while their own child worked 3 jobs to afford community college. And my father's gambling. How had I never noticed? But of course I hadn't noticed. He'd kept it completely separate from his life with me, from our family life in the small apartment where we supposedly struggled to make ends meet. His gambling happened in his other life, the secret life, the life funded by my money. I thought about all the times he'd been working late, or gone on business trips. How many of those had actually been trips to casinos? How many times had he been in Vegas or Atlantic City, losing tens of thousands of dollars in a single night, while I was home studying for exams and worried about whether I'd have enough money for textbooks next semester? My mother's shopping too. I'd never seen her in expensive clothes, never noticed designer labels or luxury items. But now I realized that's because she'd never worn them around me. She'd kept that part of her life completely hidden, stored expensive items at other locations, lived her real life somewhere else where I couldn't see it. They'd created this elaborate fiction, this complete false reality, and they'd maintained it perfectly for nearly 3 decades. They'd played their roles flawlessly, had never slipped up in ways I could catch, had never let me see behind the curtain to the truth of what they were doing. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how calculated it had been. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness that spiraled out of control. This was systematic, planned, deliberately concealed theft that had gone on for years. They'd made thousands of individual choices to continue lying to me, continue stealing from me, continue letting me suffer when they had the power to end that suffering at any moment. Every time I'd called home crying about money stress, every time I'd told them about working double shifts or going to sleep hungry, or worrying about making loan payments, they'd had a choice. They could have told me the truth. They could have stopped stealing from me. They could have done the right thing. They never did. Not once. Not in 28 years did they ever choose honesty or integrity, or their child's well-being over their own comfort and desires. That's what hurt most of all. Not the money itself, though losing $7 million was catastrophic. What hurt was the betrayal, the realization that the people who were supposed to love me most, protect me most, care about my welfare above their own, had done the exact opposite. They'd chosen themselves over and over and over again, for my entire life. They'd watched me struggle and they'd done nothing. Worse than nothing. They'd actively caused my struggle. They'd stolen my security and then watched me suffer from its absence without ever once considering that maybe, just maybe, their child's well-being should matter more than their own greed. The full scope of what my parents had done took weeks to piece together completely, but the general outline became clear within those first few days after the revelation in my grandfather's study. And watching him learn the truth, seeing what it did to him, was almost as painful as learning it myself. My grandfather had always been a strong man, physically and emotionally. He'd survived poverty, the Depression, World War II, where he'd served in the Pacific Theater, decades of brutal business competition, the death of my grandmother when he was only 60. He'd faced every challenge life threw at him with determination and resolve, never backing down, never showing weakness. But this broke something in him. I could see it happening, see the light dimming in those sharp blue eyes, see the weight settling onto shoulders that had carried so much for so long. He blamed himself. That's what hurt to watch most of all. He kept saying he should have known, should have checked more carefully, should have demanded more documentation. He kept going over the statements, pointing out places where he could have asked questions, should have noticed something was off. The trust had still been growing overall during those first 10 years or so, still showing positive returns even with the withdrawals, so he'd assumed everything was fine. But he should have looked closer, should have questioned why the growth wasn't as strong as it could have been, should have asked what exactly those educational expenses and general welfare withdrawals were funding. I tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he'd trusted his own son to do the right thing, that anyone would have made the same assumptions. But he couldn't accept that. He'd built his entire fortune on attention to detail, on questioning everything, on never accepting surface explanations when money was involved. And when it had mattered most, when it was his grandson's future on the line, he'd been too trusting. He'd trusted his son. That's what he kept coming back to. He'd trusted his own child, the boy he'd raised, the man he'd taught about integrity and hard work and doing the right thing even when it was difficult. And that trust had been completely, utterly betrayed. The rage came later. After the shock and the grief and the self-blame, the rage set in. I saw my grandfather truly angry for the first time in my life, and it was frightening. Not physically frightening, he wasn't violent or out of control, but frightening in its intensity, in its cold calculation, in the way it transformed him from a kind old man into the ruthless businessman who'd crushed competitors and built an empire through sheer force of will. He called my parents. I was there when he did it, sitting in his study on a gray morning about 2 weeks after the initial revelation, while his attorneys worked in the next room preparing legal documents. He put the call on speaker so I could hear, so I could witness this confrontation that felt like it had been building for 3 decades. My father answered on the third ring. His voice was cautious, wary. They hadn't spoken since that day in the study, since they'd left and the truth had started coming out. He said hello like he was afraid of what might come next, and he was right to be afraid. My grandfather didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told my father that he knew everything, that investigators had traced the money, had documented the theft, had found the house and the cars and the vacations and the gambling losses and all of it, that there was no point in denying it anymore, no room for explanations or excuses or attempts to spin this as anything other than what it was. My father tried anyway. His voice shook as he started talking, started trying to explain. It wasn't supposed to go this way, he said. The business was supposed to succeed. He was supposed to pay it all back. He'd had every intention of replacing the money before I turned 25. Things had just gotten away from him, spiraled out of control, become more complicated than he'd anticipated. My grandfather let him talk for a while, let him dig himself deeper with every word, every excuse, every attempt to frame this as anything other than deliberate theft from his own child. And then, in a voice colder than anything I'd ever heard from him, my grandfather spoke. He said that my father was no son of his, that the boy he'd raised, the man he'd tried to teach about integrity and honor, and taking responsibility for your actions, that person was dead, if he'd ever really existed at all. That what remained was a thief and a liar who'd stolen from a child, from his own child, and had shown no remorse until he'd been caught. My father tried to argue, said that my grandfather didn't understand, that he'd had no choice, that circumstances had forced his hand, that he'd been trying to provide for his family. My grandfather cut him off. He said there was no justification, no circumstance that made stealing from your child acceptable, that my father had had countless choices over the years, thousands of opportunities to do the right thing, and he'd chosen wrong every single time. Then my grandfather told him about the lawsuits. Civil suits to recover as much of the money as possible, to seize the house and the cars and anything else that had been purchased with funds from the trust. criminal referrals to the district attorney for theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. He was throwing everything at them, using every legal avenue available, and he had the resources to pursue this to the fullest extent possible. My father's voice changed then, became desperate. He started pleading, saying they'd lose everything, that this would destroy them, that surely there was some way to work this out within the family without involving courts and lawyers and public scandal. He appealed to my grandfather as his father, begged him to show mercy, to remember that they were family. My grandfather's response was devastating in its simplicity. He said that my father had shown no mercy to me, his own son, when he'd watched me struggle unnecessarily for years. That family meant nothing to someone who could do what my father had done. That there would be no working this out, no mercy, no sweeping this under the rug to avoid scandal. That my father would face the full consequences of his actions, and those consequences would be severe. Then he hung up. Just ended the call without saying goodbye, without any closing words, just clicked the phone off and sat there in his chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him look. The silence that followed was heavy. My grandfather stared at the phone in his hand like it was something foreign, something he didn't quite recognize. Then he looked at me, and I saw tears in his eyes again. He apologized. He said he was sorry for his son, sorry that I'd been born into this family, sorry that the people who should have protected me had been the ones to harm me most. He said he'd give me money, try to make up for what had been stolen, but we both knew it wasn't really about the money anymore. You can't give someone back the years they lost, the opportunities that passed them by, the person they would have been if they'd grown up secure instead of anxious. I told him it wasn't his fault, that he'd done what he thought was right, setting up the trust, trying to give his grandchildren a better start than he'd had, that he couldn't have known his own son would betray that trust so completely. But I don't think he believed me. I think he carried that guilt with him every day for the rest of his life, the knowledge that his son had stolen from his grandson, and he hadn't caught it until it was too late. The legal process moved forward with the momentum of a freight train. My grandfather's attorneys filed lawsuits in multiple jurisdictions, seeking to recover assets, freeze accounts, seize property. They filed criminal complaints with the district attorney, providing all the documentation the investigators had compiled. They were thorough and relentless, the way my grandfather had always been in business, the way he wished he'd been in overseeing his grandson's trust. My parents tried to fight it at first. They hired lawyers, though not good ones because good lawyers are expensive and most of their stolen money was already spent. They tried to argue that they'd acted within their rights as trustees, that the withdrawals had been discretionary decisions made in my best interest, that the documentation supported their use of the funds. Their arguments fell apart quickly under scrutiny. Yes, they'd had discretion in managing the trust, but that discretion was supposed to be exercised for my benefit, not theirs. And the evidence was overwhelming that the vast majority of the money had gone to their own lifestyle, their own desires, their own problems. The house wasn't in my name. The cars weren't registered to me. The credit card bills they'd paid off were for their purchases, not mine. The vacation photos showed them traveling without me. The gambling losses were my father's, not mine. The business that failed had been his dream, his company, not something I'd had any involvement in or benefit from. My community college tuition and fees, which should have been covered by the trust, had been paid for with loans and my own wages. They couldn't explain any of it in a way that made their actions look like anything other than theft. The house was seized first. My parents had to move out within 30 days, had to watch as the property they'd bought with my stolen money was taken from them and put up for sale, with the proceeds going toward repaying what they owed. The cars were repossessed next. The luxury items that could be found and identified as purchased with trust funds were confiscated. Bank accounts were frozen. Their comfortable life, built on the foundation of my stolen future, disintegrated around them. My mother called me once during this period. I'd changed my number, but she got it somehow, probably from a relative I'd told before I'd stopped talking to extended family about any of this. Her voice on the other end of the line was broken, desperate, pleading. She said she was sorry, said she loved me, said she'd made mistakes but she was still my mother and didn't that count for something? I asked her why she'd done it. Why she'd watched me struggle when she could have helped. Why she'd let me believe I was poor when there was money with my name on it. Why she'd stolen my future, and then acted like she cared about my well-being. She didn't have good answers. She talked about how hard it had been, how stressful, how my father's business failure had put so much pressure on them, how the money had been right there, and it had seemed like it wouldn't hurt anything to use just a little bit. How it had gotten out of control before she realized what was happening. How she'd wanted to tell me so many times, but she'd been too afraid of what I'd think of her. I told her I thought she was a thief and a liar who'd betrayed her own child for money. Then I hung up. I blocked the number. I never spoke to her again. The criminal case moved forward more slowly than the civil suits, but it moved. The district attorney's office reviewed the evidence and decided there was enough for criminal charges. Theft, fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, multiple counts spanning multiple years. The potential sentences were serious, possibly decades in prison if they were convicted on all counts. My parents' lawyers advised them to take a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming, and a trial would only result in harsher sentences. The prosecutors offered a deal. Plead guilty to reduce charges, accept substantial prison time, agree to repay what could be repaid, and avoid a lengthy public trial that would air all the details of their theft. My father took the deal. He pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. My mother, who'd been less directly involved in the actual management of the trust, but had certainly benefited from and participated in the theft, received 5 years. They were both remanded to custody immediately after sentencing, no time to get their affairs in order, just handcuffed and led away to begin serving their sentences. I didn't attend the sentencing. I couldn't bring myself to go. To see them standing there in front of a judge, to hear them make statements about how sorry they were and how they wished they could take it back. My grandfather went. He sat in the courtroom and watched his son be sentenced to prison, and afterward, he told me it was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. But he also said it was necessary. That actions have consequences, that betrayal can't be swept under the rug just because it's family, that sometimes the only way to get justice is to pursue it relentlessly even when it hurts. The civil suits resulted in judgments totaling over $6 million, plus interest and legal fees. Not that my parents would ever be able to pay it. The house sale, the car sales, the liquidation of their remaining assets, all of it together recovered maybe $1.5 million. The rest was gone, spent and unrecoverable. You can't get back money that was gambled away or spent on depreciating assets years ago. You can't squeeze blood from a stone. My grandfather offered to make up the difference. He said he'd give me what had been stolen, try to put me in the position I would have been in if the trust had been managed properly. But I couldn't accept it, not fully. He gave me some money, enough to pay off my student loans and buy a modest house and have some security, but I didn't want the full amount. It felt wrong somehow. Like taking it would be letting my parents off the hook, like it would suggest that money could fix what they'd broken. Because money couldn't fix it. $7 million couldn't give me back the years I'd spent struggling. Couldn't give me back the study abroad semester I'd passed on because I couldn't afford it. Couldn't give me back the internships I'd turned down because they didn't pay enough to live on. Couldn't give me back the friendships I'd lost because I was always working and never had time to socialize. Couldn't give me back the confidence and security I would have had growing up knowing I had a safety net instead of growing up afraid I'd end up homeless if I made one wrong financial decision. Money couldn't give me back my relationship with my parents, couldn't undo the betrayal, couldn't make me trust again the way I'd trusted before I knew what they'd done. It couldn't repair the fundamental damage to my understanding of family and love and loyalty. My grandfather understood that. I think it hurt him that he couldn't fix it, couldn't make it right just by throwing money at the problem. He'd spent his whole life solving problems with money, building wealth as a solution to poverty, and now he faced a problem that money couldn't solve no matter how much of it he had. We grew closer after all this, he and I. We'd been kept apart for so long by my parents' lies and manipulations, but now there was nothing standing between us. I visited him every week, sometimes more often. We talked about everything, made up for lost time, built the relationship we should have had all along. He told me stories about his life, about growing up poor during the Depression, about the war, about building his business from nothing. He told me about my grandmother, who I'd barely known because she'd died when I was young. He told me about his hopes for the future, about what he wanted his legacy to be. And I told him about my life, the real version, not the sanitized version my parents had fed him for years. I told him about the struggles, the fears, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep worried about money. I told him about the dreams I'd had to give up, the opportunities I'd missed, the person I thought I'd never get to be. We grieved together for what had been lost. And we tried to figure out how to move forward, how to build something good from the wreckage of my parents' betrayal. That was 14 months ago now. 14 months since that afternoon in my grandfather's study when a simple question shattered my entire understanding of my life. Sometimes it feels like it happened yesterday. Sometimes it feels like it happened to someone else entirely. The practical aftermath has been complicated. I used the money my grandfather gave me to pay off my student loans, all $60,000 of them. And the relief of not having that weight hanging over me was immense. I bought a small house, nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom in a decent neighborhood. I have savings now, real savings, an emergency fund that means I don't lie awake at night anymore panicking about what would happen if my car broke down or I got sick. I quit the job I hated, the marketing position I'd taken because it was the best offer I got right out of college, and I took time to figure out what I actually wanted to do. I went back to school part-time for a graduate degree in something I'm passionate about. I took an unpaid internship at a design firm, the kind of opportunity one never could have considered before because I couldn't afford to work without a paycheck. That internship turned into a job offer, and now I'm doing work I actually love, building the career I always wished I could have. Practically speaking, my life is better now than it's ever been. I have security, stability, opportunities one never dreamed I'd have access to. I'm living the life I should have been living all along, the life the trust fund was meant to give me. But emotionally, psychologically, I'm still trying to process what happened. Still trying to rebuild my sense of self after learning that my entire identity was built on a lie. I'd grown up thinking I was the person who'd overcome poverty through hard work and determination. That was my story, my narrative, my understanding of who I was. I was proud of that identity. It made me feel strong, capable, resilient. It gave meaning to all the suffering, turned struggle into character-building experience. But it was all based on a lie. I wasn't poor. I wasn't overcoming anything. I was just a person with wealthy grandparents whose parents had stolen from them, made to struggle needlessly while money that belonged to them sat unused. There was nothing noble about it, nothing character-building, nothing that made sense or meant anything. I had to rebuild my entire self-concept from scratch. Had to figure out who I was when I wasn't the scrappy kid who'd worked 3 jobs to get through college. Had to learn to accept help, accept wealth, accept that I didn't have to prove myself through suffering anymore. It's been harder than I expected. I still have panic attacks about money sometimes, even though I have plenty now. I still check my bank account multiple times a day, still feel guilty when I spend money on anything that isn't absolutely necessary. I still work too much, push myself too hard, struggle to relax or take time off because years of survival mode aren't easy to undo. I'm in therapy now. Good therapy, the kind I could never afford before. My therapist says I have complex PTSD from years of financial trauma, from the stress of survival mode, from the fundamental betrayal by the people who were supposed to protect me. She says it will take time to heal, that I can't expect to undo 28 years of conditioning and trauma in a few months. I don't talk to my parents anymore. They're in prison, and they'll be there for years yet. They've tried to contact me, letters and phone calls and messages through relatives. All of them saying they're sorry, they love me, they want to make things right. I don't respond. I can't. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive them for what they did, for the years they stole from me, for the way they watched me suffer and said nothing. My grandfather says I should forgive them eventually, not for their sake but for mine, because carrying that anger and hatred will only hurt me in the long run. Maybe he's right. Maybe someday I'll be able to forgive them. But not yet. Not now. The wound is still too fresh, too deep. My extended family has fractured over this. Some relatives think I'm being too harsh, that family is family and I should be willing to reconcile, that my parents made mistakes but they're still my parents. Others understand the magnitude of what was done to me, support my decision to cut contact, are dealing with their own anger at my parents for what they did. My aunt, my mother's sister, the one whose kids benefited from stolen money, has tried to apologize. She's offered to pay back the $300,000 my parents gave her for her kids' college funds, even though she didn't know where the money came from, even though she's not remotely wealthy enough to pay that back without ruining herself financially. I told her to keep it. Her kids didn't do anything wrong, and punishing them for my parents' crimes won't help anyone. But our relationship is strained now. Every time I see my cousins, I think about how they went to college debt-free with my money while I worked 3 jobs and took out loans. It's not their fault, I know that intellectually, but it still hurts. So I've distanced myself from that side of the family, keep in touch but not closely, protect myself from reminders of what was taken from me. I've had to learn to trust again, and that's been perhaps the hardest part of all this. My parents' betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about the fundamental assumption that the people who love you will protect you, will act in your best interests, will tell you the truth even when it's hard. They violated that trust in the most complete and devastating way possible. They lied to me every single day for 28 years. Every time they looked at me, they were choosing to maintain the lie, choosing to let me continue suffering, choosing their own comfort over my well-being. That kind of betrayal changes you. It makes it hard to trust anyone, hard to believe that people mean what they say, hard to let yourself be vulnerable because vulnerability got you hurt so badly before. I'm trying though. I'm trying to build new relationships based on honesty and real trust. I'm trying to let people in, to believe them when they say they care about me, to not automatically assume everyone is hiding something or lying to me. It's slow going. Some days are better than others. My relationship with my grandfather has been the bright spot in all of this. He's in his late 80s now, and I'm acutely aware that our time together is limited. We're making the most of it, though. We talk for hours about everything and nothing. He's teaching me about business and investing, sharing the knowledge he accumulated over a lifetime of building wealth. I'm learning from him, not just about money but about integrity, about making hard choices, about living with your decisions. He's changed his will. My parents are completely cut out, obviously. Everything will go to his grandchildren now, divided equally among us, with ironclad trusts that can't be touched by anyone else. He's learned his lesson about trust, about assuming the best of people just because they're family. The new trusts have multiple trustees, regular audits, strict accountability measures. He's making sure what happened to me can never happen to anyone else in our family. I know he still blames himself. He tries to hide it, but I can see it in his eyes sometimes, that look of regret and guilt and self-recrimination. He gave me money, opportunities, a chance to build the life I should have had all along, but he can't give me back the years that were stolen. He can't undo the damage, can't make it so it never happened. And that knowledge eats at him, I think, the knowledge that he failed to protect me when I needed protection most. I try to tell him it's not his fault. I try to make him understand that he did everything right, that he was the victim here too, betrayed by his own son. But I don't think he'll ever fully believe that. I think he'll carry that guilt until the day he dies, and that breaks my heart almost as much as what my parents did. The legal resolution brought some closure, but not as much as I'd hoped. My parents are in prison, the assets they bought with stolen money have been seized and sold. There were consequences for what they did. But consequences don't undo damage. Punishment doesn't give you back what was taken. Justice doesn't heal wounds, it just acknowledges they exist. I think about what my life would have been like if this had never happened. If my parents had been honest, if they'd managed the trust the way they were supposed to, if I'd grown up knowing I had security instead of growing up in artificial poverty. I'd be a different person. More confident, maybe. Less anxious. I wouldn't have the survival skills I developed, the work ethic that comes from necessity, the ability to endure hardship that I learned through years of struggling. Would I trade who I am now for who I would have been? I don't know. Part of me wants to say no, wants to find meaning in the suffering, wants to believe that the struggles made me stronger and better. But that feels like Stockholm Syndrome, like trying to find value in trauma to make it hurt less. The truth is, I shouldn't have had to choose. I shouldn't have had to suffer to become strong. I could have been strong and secure. I could have had both. The lesson I've learned from all this isn't a simple one. It's not a neat moral about hard work or family or trust. It's messier than that, more complicated, more painful. What I've learned is that people can love you and still betray you in the most fundamental ways. That the people who are supposed to protect you can be the ones you most need protection from. That family doesn't automatically mean loyalty or integrity, or having your best interests at heart. I've learned that money isn't just money. It's security, it's opportunity, it's freedom from constant stress and anxiety. The people who say money doesn't buy happiness are usually people who've never been poor, who've never had to choose between eating and paying rent, who've never had to give up their dreams because they couldn't afford to pursue them. I've learned that discovering the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living in a lie someone else has crafted for you. Even though the truth destroyed my relationship with my parents, even though it shattered my understanding of my own life, I'm better off knowing. Better to live in painful reality than comfortable delusion. I've learned that trauma changes you, that you can't just bounce back from betrayal like nothing happened, that healing takes time, maybe a lifetime, maybe forever, that some wounds don't fully close, they just become scars you learn to live with. I've learned that forgiveness isn't simple or easy or automatic, that sometimes the people who hurt you don't deserve forgiveness, and you're not a bad person for refusing to give it. That forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person who wronged you. And you can't force it before you're ready. And most importantly, I've learned that discovering who you really are, underneath all the lies and false narratives and identities built on fiction, is worth the pain of losing who you thought you were. I don't know who I am yet, not fully. I'm still figuring that out, still building a self-concept based on truth instead of lies. But at least now whatever I become, it will be real. It will be mine. It will be based on truth instead of the elaborate deception my parents maintained for my entire life. I may never fully trust again the way I trusted before all this. I may always have that edge of suspicion, that instinct to question people's motives, that difficulty believing what people tell me. I may always struggle with money anxiety despite having more than enough. I may always carry the weight of what was done to me, what was taken from me, who I could have been if my parents had simply done the right thing. But I'm here. I'm alive. I'm building a life based on truth. And I know now what I'm really worth, both financially and as a human being who deserved better than what I got. That knowledge is worth something. Maybe not $7 million. Maybe not all the years I lost or the opportunities one missed or the version of myself that was stolen along with the money. But it's worth something. And maybe someday, that will be enough.